In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural rough sand material. So after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join it together into a custom node group so you can customize the look of the material. So we have the overall scale, so you can change the entire size of the material depending on the size of your object. Then we also just have the rock scale if you want to make those rocks bigger or smaller. And then we have a rock individual size. So this is going to make the individual rocks bigger or smaller. So you can see it looks really chunky now, or you can keep the rocks quite small. Then we have a few different colors. So we have the rock color, so you could make really dark rocks if you want to. I like them looking a bit more subtle. And then we have a few colors for the sand. So we have this sand color 1, which is the main color of the sand. And then we also have sand color 2, and this is a secondary color for the sand. Then we also have the detail value. So this is the detail value of like all the textures. So you can make it less detailed if you want to. And then we have this roughness here. So because this is a really rough sand, I want it to look very dry and rough. So I turn the roughness way up, but you could turn it down and make it more shiny if you want to. Then we also have the sand bump strength 1, and this is some larger bump. Then we have bump strength 2, which is kind of some smaller bump. And then we have the rocks bump. And then finally we have the displacement strength to actually pop out the mesh. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And you can also purchase my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to get access to all of my procedural materials. And my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack also comes with future updates, so when I create more materials, I update the Ultimate Procedural Material Pack. You can also purchase my Procedural Material Packs, which are packs of 10 materials, and you can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube to learn how to create any of my procedural materials. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I added an icosphere, and right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I turned up the subdivisions to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round, and I shaded it smooth, and that way it has lots of geometry so it can use the displacements, because the displacements uses the geometry of the mesh to pop out the displacements. I also scaled the object down by 0.2 so it is a better size, pressed Ctrl A, and I applied the scale. Then I also went to the add menu and I added a plane because I wanted to preview this on a plane, and I brought the plane down, kind of scaled it down and moved it back a little bit. And I went to edit mode, and you can press Ctrl E and you can choose subdivide, and then click right here right behind me on the subdivide settings, and you can just turn up the subdivide settings, maybe turn it up to like a 30 or something, maybe even like a 40, so it is more detailed so the displacements can make it all bumpy. Then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects, and over here on the output properties I made the resolution 1080 by 1080 and then a 200% so that it is a square image. And also right over here on the render properties, it's really important that you use the cycles rendering engine if you want to use the material displacements, because the material displacements won't work in Eevee, so make sure you're using cycles. So I'm going to go up into the rendered viewport mode to show you the lighting. So I added a few different lights. So I added this area light right here, and for this area light I set the power to 250 and I changed the shape to rectangle so that it's kind of long. And then I also duplicated that light and I made a much bigger one. This one the power was set to 300 and it was kind of like an orangey color, and then this one is a rectangle shape as well. And then also I went over here to the world properties and I added in this abandoned workshop HDRI from polyhaven.com. The link will be in the description if you'd like to download it, and I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. So to add in the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot next to color, you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button to open up the downloaded HDRI. And then if you go right over here to the render properties, we are using cycles, and then also let's scroll down here and open up the film tab, and you can check mark the transparent button if you want to make the background transparent so it's not as distracting and you can't see it. And then also if you want to open up the color management here, I changed the view transform to filmic, and I set the look to very high contrast to make the colors more contrasted and saturated. So I went over to the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here and I'm in the rendered viewport mode, and I have the shader editor right over here. So we'll select the object and we'll add a new material, and I can just rename this material to rough sand, and then I can click and drag and drop this material on the other object so they both have the same rough sand material. Now I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes, so you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and over here on the add-ons tab you can go to the search, you can search for the Node Wrangler and just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on so it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So what I first want to do is make the first sand texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and we can drop it here. And then with any texture selected, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select that node. And that is going to preview the node on the object by just Control Shift and selecting the different nodes. Now also with the noise texture selected, I'll press Control T, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. So we'll put the object into the vector. And then we can box select these two nodes here, and I want to keep my nodes really nicely organized so it's easy to understand. So if we box select these nodes, I can press Control J to join them together into a frame. And you can click on the frame and move it around, and that will move around all the nodes in the frame. And if you select the frame, you can press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this mapping. So this is totally optional, but I just like to do it to keep the nodes nicely organized. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 15, and then let's also turn the detail to the max of 15, so it's really detailed. And I'll turn the roughness up to 0.6, that'll make it even more detailed. And I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now I want to make it look like sand, so I need to add some colors, and I want the colors to be customizable. So to do this, I can go to the add menu and I can search for a mix color, and we'll put this here after the noise. Now the noise texture factor can go into the factor of the mix, and this way the factor is determining what parts will be color A and what parts will be color B, so the black and white values will be color A and B. So for color A here, I can make this the main base color of the sand. So it's going to be kind of like a dark brownish or a little bit more towards the orange. And then color B, this is going to be a very dark brown. And if you want to use the exact same colors that I'm using, you can use the same hex values. So for color A, this will be a hex value of 684217. And then color B, this is going to be a hex value of 280700. So let's box select these nodes. I'll press Control J to add a frame. You can select the frame, press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this sand. So let's now make the group of textures for the rocks. So I'll go to the add menu and we'll search for a Voronoi texture, drop this up here. And again, I want to use the object coordinates, so the vector of the mapping can go into the vector of the Voronoi. And let's Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And I can change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to a really big number of 135. And you can see now we have these little dots here, so it looks like rocks. And the detail here, I'll turn to 2, so the rocks are a little bit more detailed and they kind of have a random shape. And then the roughness, I'll leave it 0.5. And then the lacunarity here, this is going to make some little dots, but I don't really want that. So I'll turn it down a little bit. So I'll turn this to a 1.7 instead of a 2. So there's a little bit less of the lacunarity. Now these dots here are going to be where the rocks are, but later on when we create the custom node group, I want to be able to change the individual rock size. So if we make it darker, that'll be able to see the rocks better, so it'll make the rocks look larger. So if I go to the add menu, I can search for a hue saturation value, and I'll put this after the Voronoi. Now the value here, if I drag this, it'll make it darker or lighter. So when we put this in the custom node group, by turning this down and making the rocks darker, they're going to look bigger. So we'll use that later in the custom node group. Now I want the rocks to look much more sharp because it's not really clear where the rocks are. It's kind of gray. So I'll go to the add menu and we'll just add a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp here after the hue saturation value. And then I can make it very contrasty by dragging both of these tabs together. So I'll drag the black tab to about here and I'll drag the white tab really close to about there. So now you can see we have this rock texture, but this value here is still going to make the rocks bigger or smaller. So we'll use that in the custom node group to change the size of the rocks. Now I'm also going to put this rock texture into the bump just to give it some surface bump. However, if we put this into the bump, it's going to look really sharp, and I'll show you later what that's going to do, but I don't want it to look that sharp because I want the rocks to look round. So on the top here, they're going to be at the highest point and they're going to go down on the sides. So I want to use the same texture, but I don't want it to be as sharp. So we'll select the color ramp and I'll press Control Shift D to duplicate the node but keep the wire plugged up. And I can Control Shift and select the color ramp. Now I want to take this black tab here and I want to drag it back, but the white tab is going to stay exactly where it is. So it is a bit hard to see, but this way the darkest point there is in the center, and then it will be a gradient and it will slowly get lighter and lighter. So I'll show you later what that does when we put it into the bump, but that'll make the rocks look more bumpy and they're not going to be super sharp. So let's box select these nodes. I'll join them into a frame, and I can add a label, and I can just call this rocks, because these are the textures that made the rock. Let's just drag this over here. I can put the noise back and maybe drag the mix over. We can also box select these and kind of move them over here. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is join the rocks and the sand together, and we'll be putting that into the base color. So what I can do is select the color ramp, hold down the shift key and select this mix color here, which has the main colors, and I'll press Control 0. So Control 0 is going to add this mix node here. We can drag this up here, and the color ramp color, this is going to go into the factor to determine what parts will be color A and what parts will be color B. And then this sand color, this is the base color of the sand, that is going to go into color B. So now color A here, this can be the color of the rocks. So you can see basically the rocks are on top of the sand texture. And if you want to use the same exact hex value that I'm using for the rock color, then you can use a hex value of 47290C. And you can make it a darker color if you want to, but I find if the rocks are too dark, they just kind of stand out too much. So I like just kind of a subtle brown color. So we can put the result into the base color, and let's Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. I can zoom out here. So that's going to be the base color of the texture. Now you can see it looks a little bit reflective and a little bit shiny, and it will look more rough when we add the normal and the displacement, but I do want to make this a very rough sand. So here on the roughness, I'm going to turn this to a 0.9, so it's super dry and rough. So this material is very smooth, and so I want to give it some normal. So we're going to put some textures into the normal here to give it some bump. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and let's drop the noise texture right down here. And then we want to use the same mapping. So we're using the object coordinates. So we'll put the vector into the vector of the noise texture, and let's Control Shift and select it to preview it. And we'll change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 50, and I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, and I'll turn the roughness to a 0.7. So it's very detailed, and I'll leave the other settings how they are. So I want to put this into the normal, but if I just put the factor and just stick it into the normal and then Control Shift and select the principled shader, you can see there's going to be some weird shading issues. That is because this is black and white data, but this here is normal data. So to convert it to normal data, you can go to the add menu and we can search for the bump node. We'll put this between the wire, between the principled shader and the normal, and I'll just stick it down here. Now the factor needs to be going into the height value, and that'll convert it to bump data so it looks nice and bumpy now. But it's way too strong, so here on the strength value, I'll just turn it down to like a 0.1. Now I'm going to select these nodes and bring them down a bit, and I also want to add another texture into this bump. So I'll drag the bump over here, I'll press Shift to duplicate it and put another bump right up here above it. And then what we're going to do is use this noise texture. So we're going to put the factor into the height value of this bump, and then this bump normal can go into the normal of this bump. So that way we first are using this noise texture. If I Control Shift and select it, this is going to be some larger bump, but then we have this other bump here, and I can Control Shift and select this one to preview it, and that's going to be some smaller bump. So you can kind of see what they're doing by dragging the strength values. And then I also want to add another bump, and this is going to be for the rocks. So we'll duplicate the bump again, we can put it down here, and the normal can go into the normal because this one has already converted it to bump data, so the normal can go through the normal, but we now have another height value that we can add data into. So what we're going to do is take this color ramp here, and we're going to put that into the bump. Now I mentioned this earlier, but I don't want to use this color ramp because if I put this color ramp here, if I put this into the height value, I can Control Shift and select the bump to preview it. And let's turn the strength up so it's a lot bigger or it's a lot stronger. You can see if I zoom in here, it doesn't really look like rocks. It just looks really flat. It kind of looks like some water droplets, but that's not what I want because it's super flat. And that is because it's too contrasty. So instead, we're going to use this one here, and this one has a nice gray gradient. So we're going to put the color into the height value instead on this one. And if I Control Shift and select it, you can see now it actually looks like these little bumps here. Now they look like they're going back in. So I'm going to click on the invert so that they look like they're popping out. So now it looks like there's these little round rocks or little pebbles. So the normal can go into the normal here, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So now it looks like little rocks over the surface. Now it is too strong, so I'm going to turn the strength value of this bump to just like a 0.3, so it is more subtle. All right, so I can drag this bump down here. Let's box select these nodes. We'll join them together into a frame, and I'll select the frame and press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this bump. because these are all the bump nodes. So it's starting to look like a rough sand material, but it still looks kind of boring and it doesn't really look that realistic because it actually isn't being displaced. So it looks really smooth. So let's add some displacement. So for this, I'm going to be adding one more texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for another Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here. And then we want the same mapping vector to be going into the vector of the Voronoi. And then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. Now this line here, or this wire, is overlapping. So what I'll do is hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over the wire and let go. And that is going to add this little dot here, which is called a reroute. And I can drag the reroute over here. And again, this is just to keep the nodes nicely organized, but it doesn't actually affect the look of the material. But that way it goes down here and then the wire goes over. All right, so let's Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture twice. So if you're not selecting it, just hold down the Control and Shift key and then click on it twice because we want to preview the color. And now let's change the Voronoi settings. So on the F1 here, I'm going to change this to smooth F1 instead. And then I'll turn the scale to a 10 so it is smaller. And also let's make it pretty detailed. So I'll turn the detail to 15 and I'll turn the roughness to like 8.6. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So we're going to use this texture and we're going to put this into the displacement. But if we put the color data up to the displacement is also a purple dot. So what we need to do is convert the color data or the black and white data into displacement data. So we'll go to the add menu and we're going to search for the displacement node and we'll put this here after the Voronoi. Now you can see that the color is going into the normal, but we actually don't want that. So we're going to unplug it from the normal and we're going to stick it into the height value instead. And then I can drag the displacement down here. And then we want this displacement to be going into the displacement of the material output. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. So now you can see it does look really bumpy, but if you look on the sides here, it's not actually displacing the mesh. Now, if it isn't displacing the mesh for you, there's just a few things that you need to go over to make sure it works. So if you open up the side panel here, I mentioned this at the beginning of the tutorial, but make sure that you're using the Cycles rendering engine because Eevee doesn't support displacements. And then also go here to the material settings and we want to scroll down and we want to go here to the settings and we want to go to the surface displacement. And instead of it being bump only, we want to change it to displacement and bump. And this is telling the material to use the displacements. So you can see it looks really bumpy right now, but it's way too strong. So let's go back down here to the displacement. And on this scale value, we can just turn this down to make it less strong. So I'm going to go with a displacement scale of a 0.01. So if I go into the camera view, look here on the side, you can see it looks much more realistic because it's all bumpy. So that makes the material really look a lot nicer. So we can box select these nodes, we can join them into a frame, and we can add a label and we can call this displacement. And that is it for the procedural material. So I'll now show you how to join it together into a custom node group. So we want to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. And then you can hit the tab key with the node group selected to go in and out of the node group. So I'll go out of the node group and I'll drag it over here. Let's also make it a bit bigger so we can see the custom values. And I will copy the material name and paste it here in the node group. So it's called Rough Sand. So let's select the node and I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group. And I'll press the N key to open the side panel and click here on the group tab. And here on the BSDF, I'll double click on this and I'll rename it to Shader because I like that better. Now, if you go over here to this side, you can see there's a group input, and we can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So I first want to control the overall scale, and this mapping node is plugged up to all the textures. So that way, this scale value will change the size of the entire material. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket here. And then if you click on the scale here, you can see it's going to be 3 values, but I just want it to be 1 value. So on the type here, we're going to change it to float instead. So it is 1 value. And then on the default value, I'll turn this to 1. And then let's hit tab to go out of the node group and we'll turn the scale back to 1 so you can actually see the texture. But now that'll control the size of the material. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the rock scale, so we'll drag the group input right up here. And this Voronoi texture has the scale value, so we'll put the scale into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to rock scale. Now I also want to control the rock individual size, not the whole scale of the texture, but the individual size. So if I turn the value down on the hue saturation value, that's going to make the rocks look bigger. So I'll put the value into the extra socket and double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to rock individual size. And then I want want to control the rock color, so I can drag the group input right over here, and we can take color A here from this mix and put that into the extra socket, and I can rename this to rock color. And then for the sand color, we can put color A here from this mix into the extra socket, and color B, put that into the extra socket. Let's drag this back over here, and I'll rename this to sand color 1, and then rename this one to sand color 2. Now I also want to add some detail values, and if you look right here at this noise texture and this noise texture and this Voronoi, they all have detail values of 15. Now I don't want to include this one here because this one has a detail value, but that's kind of messing up how the rocks look, so I'm not going to include this one. But we're going to take all the details from the other ones here, and we're going to put them into the same socket. So this detail, put that into this socket. We'll drag this down here, and we're going to put this detail into the same exact socket, so not a new one, but the same socket, and then drag this over here, and this detail is going to go into the same socket. That way, outside of the node group, this detail value will control all of those textures at once. So we'll go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the roughness, so we'll drag this up here, and we can put this roughness value into the extra socket. And then I also want to add the bump strengths, so we'll drag the group input right down here, and we'll take this first one here, and we'll put the strength value into the extra socket, and then the second one here, this is also sand, so we'll put this one, you can put it into the same socket if you want to, but I'm going to put it into a separate socket. And then let's rename these, so I'll rename this one to sand bump strength 1, and then if I copy this and paste it here, I'll rename this to sand bump strength 2. And this one is kind of a larger one, and this one is kind of a smaller one. And then also this one here, this is the rocks, so we'll put the strength into the extra socket here. And this one I'll rename to rocks bump strength. And then the last one that I want to add is the displacement strength. So let's drag this over here, and we'll put the scale into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to displacement strength. All right, I'll drag the group input right back over here, and I can hit the N key to close the side panel, and I'll hit the Tab key to go outside of the node group. And we can now review the final material. So we have the overall scale, and then we just have the rock scale, so you can change that rock texture. Then we have the rock individual size, so you can turn it down if you want the rocks to be bigger. And then we have the rock color, so you can make it like darker or lighter. And then we also have the sand colors 1 and 2. So you could make it more of like a yellow sand or more of like a red sand if you want to look more like a desert, like a hot desert sand, or more of like a beach sand. It could be more like a white color or a yellow color. And then we have the detail value if you want to make it less detailed. We also have the roughness if you want it to look maybe a bit more wet. And then we also have the sand bump strength. This is a larger bump strength. And then the second one here is a smaller bump strength. Then we have the rocks bump strength, so you can make the rocks really bumpy if you want to. And then finally we have the displacement strength to pop out the mesh. So that'll be it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. The links are in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials. You can also purchase my procedural material packs, which are packs of 10 materials, and you can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist. All the links will be in the description. So I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you found it useful, and thank you for watching.